Hey, Hannah, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Where are you calling in from today?
So right now I'm in London. Good old rainy, stormy London. Yeah.
And where are you normally based?
So Oakland. So all of our labs and our operations is in the Bay Area. So yeah, about 10 hours away from where we are right now.
Nice. Yeah. So you are, Juno Bio is a US based company targeting and serving the US market right now.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
All right. So listeners, don't get UK, our British ladies and men that listen, don't get too excited. It seems like they're in the US right now, but you're probably planning UK soon enough, considering you have roots there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we do a lot of work here in the UK too, but right now with majority, for the most part, focused on the US.
Yeah. Well, let's kick off this interview with learning more about you and your background. I'm so eager to understand how you went from the UK to the US and you're back in London. So tell us more about your story. Where are you from? What did you study? Did you have a career before getting into this? Or, tell us how you got here.
Yeah. So, well, to start off, I'm actually from Afghanistan. So, for me, women's health and women's rights are sort of in my very DNA, in the core of what I think is right and fair in the world. But when our family moved here when I was 5 years old, and I grew up here in London and studied here. I went to Imperial College London and then University College London, and I studied biology and then biochemical engineering. And to me, one of the most fascinating things, and I think in part because I have this sort of like immigrant background, is knowing what makes us human, and why are we here and all the rest of it. And so for me, biology was always fascinating for that reason. And then as I started studying it at Imperial and found that you can actually make things with it, it's not just something that you learn for the intellectual sort of satisfaction, I fell into biochemical engineering. And biochemical engineering for me is fascinating. It's all about how do you build bioreactors and production processes and get things, from the bench to actual people, right? Using them. And one of the really fascinating problems in biochemical engineering is how do you scale personalized medicine, and how do you scale the need for personalized fermentation processes, etc. And so one of my very first questions was, why on earth do you need to do that? Why on earth would anyone need a personalized microbial concoction? And that's how I learned about microbiomes and the fact that 56% of our cells are they're not human, they're microbial, and they have a huge impact on our health and wellness. And I started to work in that space. And so one of the more prominent things that I did was in the lab optimizing someone else's soil microbiome derived consortia of microbes. So I was trying to get these microbes to behave and clean the wastewater that they were processing in 3 days as opposed to 3 weeks. And so 5-6 years ago, when I was doing this, there was all of this incredible amount of research and commercialization of almost every single aspect of microbiomes that you can think of. So like the soil, a lot in the gut, the skin, everything. But nobody was meaningfully working on the vaginal microbiome or the microbiome as it pertains to women's health.
Of course not, because dirt, it comes above women's health, apparently. It's like, what do people value more, vaginas or dirt, right? Like that's literally what we're talking about here. And really quickly for our listeners, when you say microbes, what are microbes?
So microbes are bacteria, they're fungus or yeast, it's the same thing, they're viruses, they're all the little organisms that live in and around us in these like tiny little communities. That's what microbes and microbiomes are.
And a microbiome, is there more to it than here's like a collection of it? Is it more like it's a community of it? So what's the difference between here's a dirty tabletop with bacteria and viruses on it versus a biome?
Yeah, so a microbiome does focus on the fact that it is a community of microbes. Then they live together and they interact with each other and they rely on each other. And so, even a dirty table will have some sort of microbiome, but instead of just, focusing on microbes individually, a microbiome focuses on it as a collective sort of community and the way that they interact with each other, and relate to the environment that they're in.
Got it. So you're working with these microbiomes, these communities of microbes, bacteria, viruses, fungi. You were looking in not yeast, excuse me, soil. So what evolved next when you said like, oh, how about vaginal microbiome? What did you find? Did you find anything?
Well, so, in working in the soil, we also worked on a whole bunch of other microbiomes, but this was, personal to me, working in the space and knowing everything about it and the way that it was progressing. I saw this massive sort of gap in people's understanding and also products for the ordinary woman, when it came to the vaginal microbiome. And it shocked me because it affects billions of women, disruptions in these like vaginal microbiomes, and it affects them in a very deep way. And I think a lot of the time people don't realize how deep the problems around a disrupted vaginal microbiome is. And also, just from a scientific point of view, when you're talking about the vaginal microbiome, there's sort of mechanistic relationships between microbiomes and the conditions that they're associated with in a much more substantial way when it comes to the vaginal microbiome than you have when it comes to the gut microbiome or elsewhere. So to me, it was shocking because, it's scientifically ready to be taken forward. It affects billions of people, but nobody was working on it in a meaningful way. And so that's why I formed Juno, to close that gap that I was seeing. And I'm very, very excited to see this area flourish and to have, more people focusing on it, and to also have, Juno's product in the world being used, etc. So that's a little bit of a history of myself and the beginnings of Juno.
Yeah, and I love that. I just want to highlight something you said that I think is so important, which is we're studying the soil microbiome, the gut microbiome, and yet disruptions in those may have some consequences, but they also may not have any consequence and may just be like, oh, this is the profile of that microbiome. But when a female's vaginal microbiome is disrupted, it's typically disrupting her life, right? It's like affecting her emotions, obviously her physical health, right? They're directly corresponding to illness and conditions, and
Yes.
It's affecting her productivity. And so I cannot wait until we get into like, what is a disrupted vaginal microbiome and what are the consequences of it? First, I'd love you to plug Juno Bio. What is Juno Bio?
So at Juno Bio, we decode women's health with an at-home vaginal microbiome test. So the vaginal microbiome test that we have right now gives you the most comprehensive and curated insight into what microbes live in your vagina and what it means to you in your unique context. So you get a swab in the post at home when you order a kit, a bit like a COVID swab. You swab your vagina for 20 seconds, you pop it back in the post to us, and we return results in 5 to 10 days, which is the fastest turnaround time in our industry. And once you get your results and you have your answers, you also have a one-on-one with a vaginal coach, which is a term that I love that even exists, to answer any questions that you might have. We also then anonymize and pool everybody's results to power up further research, to really close the gender health gap beyond what we have and are doing right now.
That is so amazing. I have a lot of questions. Number one, is the microbiome inside the vagina? Because if you're a listener of the show, we all know vulvas and vagina is the whole and vulva is the full thing, right? Like, yes. So what is the microbiome inside the vagina, the same as the biome that may be on the inner labia?
It'll be a little different, but we're focused on the microbiome inside the vagina because
so when you say vaginal microbiome, you were saying in the hole, your vaginal hole microbiome. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the vulva, I'm talking about the vagina and the vaginal microbiome.
I bet you any money though. I don't know how far your company is in terms of fundraising stuff though. I bet people most often don't realize that,
sorry to interrupt, but it didn't even occur to me, Brittany, that I should actually be clarifying that. And now that you've said it, I think I should be.
Yeah, because people might think, oh, just wiping will be,
No,
reminds me a lot of Awkward Essentials, the post-sex cleanup sponge, because their investors were like, well, why can't women just wipe away the cum? And she's like, that's not how holes work. just wiping the top of a hole does not clean the inside of the tube. And they were like, oh, well, okay. So it's like kind of the same here, but all right. So we're talking about the internal vaginal microbiome. What else was I going to ask? Oh, do we have enough data sets yet to know what is a normal vaginal microbiome, or is that what we're still like collecting the data to even create the standard of healthy?
So yes and no. There is literature and there is a lot of work that helps us paint pictures of what healthy can look like. It is nuanced though, and there is a strong ethnic component. So if you're a Caucasian woman, your vaginal microbiome and your version of healthy tends to be one sort of group or type, or community state type as it's called in the literature. Or if you're, a woman from my background from the Middle East, it will be slightly different. And then also in America, what we've seen in the studies, if you're African American, you can have a vaginal microbiome that, might have been thought, if you were looking at a Caucasian woman, it's like a disrupted vaginal microbiome, but it's actually fine. And so, yes, there is the beginnings of, literature showing that there is like what healthy looks like, and there's an ethnic component. But what we've found from our data sets at Juno is that these conditions and what healthy looks like is an ongoing sort of characterization. And we've seen microbes that in the literature will have been characterized as like healthy. And we see in our data sets that actually they are consistently associated with negative symptoms. So we are learning as we go as well.
Yeah. I mean, you just opened my mind to, okay, yeah, different ethnicities, but also like if it's a woman, a girl puberty, right? Because we have the microbes in there prior to puberty, during menstruation, during in between periods, menopausal women, pregnant women. Like I can imagine that each state of a woman's life can have a different manifestation of what her normal vaginal microbiome should be. Is that the case? Do we know yet if they changes throughout her life in different life phases?
Yeah, it does change throughout your life. The ethnic component is the strongest, but as you go through your, life's journey and you hit menopause or after menopause, there is a change, of course, in your vaginal microbiome. So you're absolutely right. And also within your menstrual cycle, when you're of reproductive age, it does change as well. The great thing about the vaginal microbiome, though, compared to the gut, is that it doesn't change quite as significantly or as often as the gut microbiome. So you still, there's a relative, stability to it. So you still learn a fair amount and can action things within a reasonable, window. But you're absolutely right in that, of course, it changes throughout, your life span and during your menstrual cycle as well.
Probably your lifestyle too. Like if you are somebody training for a marathon and you're running a lot, or if you're sexually active or not sexually active, I can imagine there's just like so many factors that could change that balance. I've heard that the gut microbiome, there's a lot of research on, are you born with that certain, community of microbes? Is it because of the vaginal canal as your birth, then that inoculates you? Is it what you're eating? Do we know, by the way? I don't even know if we know. I'm asking questions that, well, it might be like the $1 million question, but how is the vaginal microbiome initially started? Like, are we born with it as females when we're born, or is it like our environment gives it to us? Do we know?
Yeah, I think everything that I've ever read points to the fact that you're sort of born with it, or that you adopt it during that process where you acquire, even your gut microbiome, which you apparently, according to some literature, acquire through your mother's vagina if you're born in that way. So I think the jury is out actually on it, but that is like the general trend in what I have read to date.
Let's get a little geeky. What are some of the major bacteria, fungi, or viruses that live in the vagina that we should know about?
So lactobacillus and the class of bacteria that are called lactobacilli is probably the most important one that people should be familiar with, because it's, tends to be the marker of like a healthy vaginal microbiome. And if you're a Caucasian woman, it's Lactobacillus crispatus a lot of the time that is like the best one. If you're from my ethnic background, you might have something called Lactobacillus innes. And sometimes, it's a type of lactobacillus that's more easily disrupted, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not ideal for you if you are from, my type of ethnic background. But lactobacilli and that class of bacteria is the most important one that I think women should really be familiar with as a term.
We know what it does. Is it just hanging out? Is it just going for the ride, or like, does it contribute anything?
Oh, it contributes in a massive way. So lactobacilli produce lactic acid. And what that does is maintain an environment. So it's a good thing to have this, though. It maintains an environment in which other bacteria that could be invading pathogens can't quite survive as well as they might like to. So, in the ideal scenario, you want to have like a lawn of lactobacillus, and it will protect you from invading pathogens. Again, this is quite different to the gut microbiome, where you want a diversity and you want to have as diverse of a, gut microbiome as possible. When it comes to the vagina, you want to have, if it's possible, as much of a lawn as opposed to a jungle of different kinds of microbes.
Like a moat. It's like our bodies built a bacterial moat to protect the womb, almost, right?
Yeah, so it has a very protective role in the vagina.
That is so cool. So where does yeast come into this? So we know we talk about yeast infections. Are yeast always there but kind of chilling, or like, is it when they show up and then they cause havoc?
So they are there, but they'll be there in a very small quantity. And whenever they get the opportunity to increase, so whenever, the vagina is disrupted in some way and not in a, optimal way, they will increase in number and change form. And then you'll get something called like a yeast infection. So they are there, but like the threshold at which they're present is a lot lower, like in a normal sort of vaginal microbiome state.
How do vaginal microbiomes get disrupted? Because I feel like there are one-off situations where like for myself, think the gods, Artemis and all of the other gods, the female gods of the world, because thank God I rarely get yeast infections. I rarely get UTIs. I'm knocking on wood right now, but I have had them, but they were very much caused by an incident, right? Like I was in high school and I was on the basketball team and like we were in a tournament and I didn't shower enough, right? Like it was a very obvious, like, oh yeah, this is what happened. But then I have some friends that it's like a chronic yeast infection, chronic UTI. So how does your vaginal microbiome get disrupted in these different ways?
I mean, when the first time your vaginal microbiome gets disrupted, it could be a number of reasons, but two of the most prevailing is an overuse of antibiotics. So you might have had antibiotics for, another reason, but what that does is it depletes the good bacteria in your vagina, and it allows for the bad bacteria or the bad yeast to grow. And so you'll have things like a yeast infection and bacterial vaginosis, and sometimes a UTI can occur because of a vaginal microbiome that's disrupted. And some, people have to know that a vagina and a urethra are separate sort of areas,
two different
right?
holes. Yeah, that's right.
Two different holes, which sometimes needs to be clarified. But the vagina does act as a reservoir that reinfects the urethra. So things like recurring UTIs can sometimes be down to a vaginal microbiome that's disrupted. So it could be an overuse of antibiotics, and that happens a lot. The other is, sometimes it's unprotected sex, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's sort of, what I call suboptimal practices. So like, maybe not showering up, but that's not something I hear very often. Or, just better practices that could be implemented. But antibiotics and unprotected sex are maybe two of the most common causes of a disrupted vaginal microbiome, I would say. But when it turns into something chronic, or when it turns into something that's recurrent, it's often because it's not diagnosed properly and not treated properly. And so it just keeps coming back again and again. Bacterial vaginosis is a condition that occurs when the vaginal microbiome is disrupted, and it occurs, 30% of women will have it every single year, at least one bout, and 10% of women in the US have it recurrently. So that's, 4 times or more a year. So it's a really large proportion of women that are not either being diagnosed properly or treated properly for just one condition associated with the vaginal microbiome. And so getting it right is really, really important, because there's not much you can do when your vagina's on fire.
I mean, preach. That's literally, yeah. If a male investor had a yeast infection for a day, all these solutions would be overfunded because it's miserable. How is it being diagnosed today?
So the gold standard right now is a culture-based test. There's the 4 criteria that need to be met, but essentially it's a culture-based test. And what that means is, if you're lucky enough to be taken seriously and the doctor takes a swab and doesn't just base it on you telling the doctor about your symptoms, the swab will be sent to the lab and they will try and grow the microbes and look at it down, look at it just like physically, phenotypically. The problem with that, of course, is that the majority of bacteria cannot be cultured in the lab. So you never really have a good view of what was on that swab. And so things like a PCR test, which is not the gold standard, it's like advanced compared to what the gold standard is, might be helpful because it'll help you look at like a handful of microbes, right, in a very targeted way. But even that is a little problematic here because, if the condition's not characterized properly, as we know that they aren't, and you miss a lot of the bacteria that you never even knew to look for, then a lot of tests come back negative, or you get the wrong diagnosis and therefore the wrong treatment, and therefore one of the highest recurrence rates in medicine.
My gosh. And I just want to break down a little bit of the science-y words you just used. So for those, culturing a cell line in laboratory, and why most bacteria can't live in a cell and laboratories, because a laboratory is very different than your vagina. And so not everything that grows in your vagina, scientists can just grow in a flask. So that's the difference there. So you're saying we take the swab, but actually the only things that we even are at the end of the day are able to look at under a microscope are the things that can live in the lab, which is not everything. Most things can't. And then the second thing you said was a PCR test. So essentially what she's saying, listeners, is taking a little look into some of the genetics of the bacteria to identify them that way versus what's able to grow. Is that correct, Hana?
Yeah. And so a PCR is better than a culture test, but it's still not as great as what we use at Juno, which is next generation sequencing, because that lets you look at all of the genetic material of all of the microbes in a sample.
Yeah, because it would be like, instead of saying, oh, well, you're British, right? It being like, well, actually, yeah, you may have a British passport or citizenship, but like deeper down, you're an Afghani woman, right? Like, and you have that heritage and that ethnicity. And so that's kind of the difference, right? Like face value versus kind of digging in deeper.
Yeah, digging in deeper. And also, like, if we're going to use that analogy, if you use a PCR test, with the current vaginal PCR test, it would never even be possible to test for whether I was Afghan or not. I mean, it's a weird analogy to use, but there you go. It would be completely missed off the list. And here I would be an Afghan, completely, being, coming back negative.
And so what are the current methods for fixing disrupted vaginal microbiome? So antibiotics are potentially causing issues. Can they also be the solution? And what are other solutions,
Yeah, antibiotics can also be the solution, but it's important to have the right antibiotic. So in order to get the right antibiotic, you need to know what you're dealing with and what microbe it is that you actually want to kill, and not just use, your best guess. But you don't just always want to just be killing the microbes. You want it to grow back in sort of the good relative proportions of good bacteria, etc. So you might also want to insert things like probiotics and prebiotics that feed probiotics. So probiotics are sort of all microorganisms, right? They're microbes that you introduce into your vagina, and then prebiotics are kind of like the food that the microbes need to thrive. But also when there are like more complicated situations, you might have things like biofilm busters and a host of other things to help you manage the process of getting your vaginal microbiome back on track. But probiotics, commonly get a bad rep because it's an unregulated sort of industry right now, so you never really know what you're getting. But good probiotics that are produced to a high standard can be really, really effective in helping you get back on track.
Yes. Are there probiotics specifically for the vagina? I feel like I've seen that, but you work in the space day and night. Are those probiotics actually tested out and true, considering we don't even know what a normal vaginal microbiome is? How do we know we're putting the right probiotics in there?
Yeah. I mean, in general, because we have some view of what a normal vaginal microbiome is, and some of these vaginal probiotics, which do exist, aren't all bad. They are good. And if you were a Juno user and you really wanted to use a probiotic, there would be some that I could point you towards with some level of confidence and tell you that I would recommend it and I would use it if I were you. So there are some good ones, and to be honest, some of them you take orally, some of them you can insert vaginally. Ideally, if you're in crisis mode, you insert them vaginally because that's the most effective and fastest route to introducing it into your vagina, essentially. But yeah, they do exist, but they can be optimized, and they also have to be the ones that fit your unique vaginal.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It's that personalized microbiome flora, right? Yeah. We've had somebody on the show talking about infertility in the bacteria in your vagina, and that, potentially that bacterial imbalance causes infertility. Are there other really major consequences of your vaginal microbiome being dysregulated or disrupted?
Yeah, there are quite a lot. So there are over 30 women's health conditions in which the vaginal microbiome is implicated. And we've talked about a couple of them in sort of what I call this end of the spectrum, right? The beginning end of the spectrum, things like bacterial vaginosis and yeast infections and recurrent UTIs. But there are a whole host of others, things like aerobic vaginitis and cytolytic vaginosis. These are things that I wish women had in their vocabulary because it's important. But
I've never even heard those words, and I'm the host of a FemTech podcast, and I've never even heard those words. So please, let's have a little lesson. Tell us more. Keep going.
Yeah. So depending on what microbes it is that are disrupted in your vagina, you will have different conditions. So cytolytic vaginosis actually occurs when you have an overgrowth of the good bacteria. So there is such a thing as too much of a good thing as a bad thing. And you might often confuse the symptoms of cytolytic vaginosis with a yeast infection. So you might be treating it with an antifungal, but all this time, the reason why you're having a recurrent yeast infection is because it's cytolytic vaginosis. So it's really important to get tested and know what you're dealing with in the first place.
Would probiotics be the bad solution then for that?
Probiotics would not be ideal for cytolytic vaginosis.
No, because it'd be like stoking the fire.
No. And in general, douching is absolutely terrible and you should avoid it at all costs. But the solution that we see studied in the research for cytolytic vaginosis is a bicarbonate soda douche. So it's like a little bit of a nuance there when it comes to even something like douching. And I have a little axe to grind, if that's the term. I don't know. This is my second language. With sort of the loss of nuance when it comes to women's health. Your vagina doesn't need a whole host of these terrible feminine hygiene products that are on the market and douches, etc. But at the same time, your vagina isn't always self-cleaning. And, you might not need douching, but sometimes there's like a little, caveat where you might. So nuance is my favorite thing in this area. But to get back to your original question of, are there some serious complications beyond what we've discussed? The answer is absolutely yes. So a disrupted vaginal microbiome leads to things like pelvic inflammatory disease, infertility, gynecological cancer, preterm birth, infectious miscarriage. So the consequences of having a disrupted vaginal microbiome is very, very serious, potentially, in a lot of cases. So you do want to make sure that you don't just dismiss it, is my advice.
Do you think, and this is just your personal opinion, like that there's potentially other chronic conditions women have that actually might be caused by an imbalanced vaginal microbiome, but we just haven't connected those dots yet?
The short answer is yes, right? What we don't know, what we don't
Probably.
we don't know what we don't know. But I mean, the link between the vaginal microbiome, these conditions of the reproductive tract, are very obvious, right? It's direct. There's a lot of mechanistic research that's gone on. But beyond that, the research would need to be done.
Because they're showing like the gut microbiome has to do with depression and autism, and it's like, okay, well then what is my vagina involved in, interesting. Well, I noticed on your website, you had this thing called the Juno study. What was the Juno study and what did you find?
So when we first formed Juno, I wanted to make sure that we really understood the best way to analyze vaginal microbiomes and understand it in a way that we weren't seeing in the literature. So we ran an IRB approved study. So that means, we went through the whole ethical review board and make sure that the protocol was like perfect in every which way possible. And we had 1,000 women from all over the US register to take part, which immediately blew my mind. We were
how did you get them? How did you register them or find them?
Yeah, I would post on online communities. And one of the really shocking thing that I discovered when I first formed Juno was that 2/3 of women with a disrupted vaginal microbiome problem, like a recurrent yeast infection, will have depression and anxiety because of it. And so these women congregate in online communities to try and help each other and figure out how to overcome this very debilitating, problem in their lives. And so it was by posting on these communities that I found the most traction in terms of people registering for the study. We actually had a vagina party to launch the study in downtown San Francisco, which was a lot of fun.
That is awesome. Yeah. I don't know how and why I haven't had a vagina party myself, but that sounds amazing.
Yeah, I recommend it. I made sure to do it on Friday the 13th to counteract, every single nonsense taboo that we have. So it was, one Friday the 13th in sort of September of 2019 that we launched the study and conducted what we conducted. And what we learned from that was a lot. We learned about the technological hurdles of analyzing vaginal microbiomes. There's a lot of human DNA in a vaginal swab. So to get to the, resolution that you need to overcome and optimize protocols in the lab, etc. And we saw correlations between symptoms that women reported and microbes that had never been sort of recorded before. We saw microbes that had never been characterized before because we were sequencing the genetics of the microbes really, really deeply.
I have to pause you because you're saying it so nonchalantly. Let me clarify what you're saying. You've sequenced 1,000 women's vaginal microbiome and asked them about symptoms that they were experiencing in their life, and then you compared them. You can't probably make conclusions, but nevertheless, that's essentially what you've done.
That's essentially what we did with the Juno study. Yeah, we built a really rich. I agree.
That is amazing. Like, everyone, please, this is incredible. Like, that's a huge. It seems so basic, right? You freaking, it's like the start of any project is like, okay, well, like, let's kind of just go out to sea, put a rod in the water, see what happens, but like, you gotta get that initial data to even start on any of this, right? So kudos to you, by the way. Just gonna pause and say, you're a rock star. This is incredible. So what else did you find?
I mean, we found a lot of the problems in the way that you analyze vaginal microbiomes, the kinds of problems that are associated with it that women that we're seeing in the study. And really what we learned from the vaginal microbiome study, we built a really rich repository of what vaginal microbiomes are, what they can look like, what kind of women's health conditions they can be implicated in sort of what way, and what therefore we should be doing in terms of how we in today. So we have a product that was informed by the Juno study, and the product and the way that we analyze the samples and the way that we conduct the protocols in the lab, all of that was informed by everything that we learned from the Juno study. And it was really, really foundational in sort of counteracting what you might have this there's this sort of general assumptions and consensus when it comes to microbiome science that is actually not accurate when it comes to the vaginal microbiome. And so what we did with the study was learn about the best ways to analyze these samples. So you might think there's, two types of sequencing, essentially. There's targeted sequencing, and there's what we call whole genome sequencing when it comes to the vaginal microbiome. The consensus is that if you use whole genome sequencing, you're better off because you're capturing not just bacteria, but also the yeast and the viruses in sort of like one step. But what we found is that there's so much host or human DNA that's actually a really bad idea for the vaginal microbiomes. And if you want to provide the most utility today, you want to do a very curated, type of sequencing where you look at bacteria and yeast and then merge what you find and give that to the customer. So we learned about how to have the most utility in terms of bringing this to women today. And it's sort of counterintuitive in sort of what we know about the science, but that's what we discovered.
It's a great example for all of you listeners on how to do a pilot study or an MVP, because before you fundraised millions of dollars and built and scaled a genetic-based test, before getting caught, 5 years down the road being like, oopsies, we shouldn't be doing whole genome sequencing, you did the right scientific move and said, hey, let's do a mini version of this. It won't be the best, it won't be pretty, it'll be chaotic, but we got to figure out what are the important variables here. And you actually figured out the test to move forward that would be best for your objective, which is not, hey, we're just researching and want to publish papers on the biome in general of the vagina. Instead, you said, we're trying to make a diagnostic for women to have answers specific to them and quickly, right? And that would be targeting sequencing the microbiome rather than also the vaginal tissues as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that we did that study. And I'm so glad that we had that insight, because, I would have made that mistake if we hadn't done it. So we've learned a lot in that process.
Is the study the reason, did the study inspire you to offer what I saw on your website, which would look like a subscription model where you send a test to the woman 4 times a year? Is that something you learned from that study or something else? And why do you offer that?
So that we learned from the product. We saw that a lot of women used the product and then kept coming back to use it again after they tried an intervention. And so I wanted to make it as, affordable as possible and make sense as much as possible for the women that were doing that. And so we launched our first subscription service, our first subscription package. And so that's for women that want to have a test 4 times a year. And a lot of women will do a test, try an intervention for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then do a test again and continue that journey to get their vaginal microbiomes back on track.
Hana, I love what you're doing. I love bacteria. I love vaginas. And I love talking to people about both. So I'm not surprised that the last 37 minutes have been awesome for me. We do have 2 last questions, though, that our listeners love. And the first one is, if someone wanted to start a FemTech startup, what is an area in women's health and wellness that you think still needs innovating?
I mean, there's so much, Brittany. That's a big question to throw my way. But I will say that one thing I don't want to see happen is for FemTech to be narrowed down into the kinds of conditions, etc., that affect our reproductive organs. So FemTech is a lot more than that, right? So it's also chronic conditions, things like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia that disproportionately affect women, but we have no real solutions for dealing with them. So what I would love to see, and if I was not building Juno, is a focus on those areas of women's health as much as we focus on the reproductive tract and everything around that.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And our last question is, what do you think the femtech industry as a whole needs the most right now in order to be successful?
Honestly, funding. So last year, the amount of funding that went to female founders or people sort of working in that space actually regressed in terms of the percentage of overall things that were funded. And so and I love that there is chatter, and I love that there's dialogue, and I love that there's awareness, but we need the money to back that up. And the biggest, most helpful thing that can happen right now for the femtech industry is to get the right dollars to the right people.
Great. How has your experience been fundraising?
Oh my God, like how much time do we have? Because when I first started, Brittany, I had people that didn't believe that women had these kind of problems. They were a group of the same kind of, white male, if I may say so. And they were like, well, I've never heard of this. And I was like, well, of course you haven't. And I was another sort of incident in a lift up to a board meeting, the final sort of IC with one investor. And he asked me not to say the word vagina because it didn't sort of like fit well. So fundraising, especially at the beginning, was very, very difficult for us. We were met with sort of a wave, a mountain of hurdles that you just wouldn't be met with if you weren't working in this sort of space. But this was a couple of years ago. Things have improved, but I'd love to see it improve even further and for us to be funding these companies in a much more, fluid way.
Aggressive manner, absolutely. Do you have any one word of advice for anyone who's listening and is fundraising and it's their first round maybe, and they're going out saying the word vagina and the room's going quiet, they're not getting calls back? Do you have a word of advice or motivation for them?
Yeah, stick to your guns, say it more, don't back down. Like it'll only change if we double down on this. So keep going.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you, Hana, so much for your time today. You are such a rock star.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.